An early morning wind rattled the dusty shutters of a modest brick bakery at the heart of Marigold Town. Though the place looked abandoned, a warm light glowed through a single window. Inside, a young woman named Esther was kneading dough with firm determination. She had grown up in this very shop, guided by her grandmother's patient hands and stories about every cake and loaf they'd produced. Her grandmother had always said that the secret to good bread was warmth, both in the oven and in the baker's heart. When Esther closed her eyes, she could still imagine her grandmother's gentle voice explaining the edges of each recipe, as if it were a cherished bedtime story. Now that she had the bakery to herself, she wondered if the memory of that voice was enough to help her navigate a much emptier, more uncertain future. Things had been tough in Marigold Town for a while. The once lively streets where vendors used to shout greetings and neighbors stopped to chat now lay silent. Factories had closed, stores were boarded up, and many families had left in search of better opportunities. But a small handful of determined townspeople remained, clinging to hope that Marigold could be reborn. Esther was one of them. Even though her bakery had to reduce its business to the bare minimum, day after day, she opened her doors, sometimes serving only a trickle of customers. Still, when she saw how the few neighbors who could afford a loaf of bread or a simple pastry brightened up at the taste, it gave her a reason to keep going. The dough trembling beneath her hands each morning felt like a living metaphor, malleable and vulnerable, yet capable of being shaped into something nourishing if tended correctly. One grisly afternoon, a flyer appeared on the community board outside the old town hall. The paper was smudged, but the words were clear. Marigold's annual harvest bake-off was returning after a 3-year hiatus. Over the years, the event had been quite a spectacle. Families would gather in the park, sampling pies, cookies, artisanal breads, and cakes, all judged by a panel of local chefs and town personalities. Winners went home with a small cash reward, but more importantly, they received recognition and validation from neighbors, friends, and local media. In better times, out-of-town visitors came just for the smell of baked goods that drifted through the streets. Then the economy collapsed, forcing the event to go on a long hiatus. Now, in a collective effort to lift everyone's spirits, the town council decided to bring it back. For Esther, seeing the flyer triggered more than a momentary excitement. It sparked a longing for connection, a chance to offer hope to her neighbors in a way that words never could. As a child, she had stood by her grandmother in the same contest. Back then, her grandmother had measured ingredients by the swirl and weight of her wooden spoon, rarely even using a measuring cup. "I can tell when the batter is ready by the sound it makes," her grandmother would say. That year, the fresh strawberry tart they entered had placed second. Esther remembered how her younger self felt an almost indescribable rush of pride at seeing her grandmother's confidence validated. More than winning, it was the effortless demonstration of love through baking that stayed with her. Now, with the contest returning, she realized she had an opportunity to stand in her grandmother's shoes. Yet the path was fraught with challenges. She didn't have the spare money to buy premium ingredients, and her baking equipment, some of which dated back to her grandmother's time, had seen better days. The front display case had a leg propped up by old magazines, and the glass was so scratched that Esther had to squint through it every morning to see which pastries remained. But the dream of competing kept igniting something deep in her heart. Remembering her grandmother's favorite recipes, Esther resolved to do everything she could to enter the contest. "If I can win even a small prize or create something memorable," she told herself, "it might bring more customers to the bakery. It might bring hope to this whole town." Esther wasn't the only excited baker in Marigold. Though many had moved away, a few talented home cooks still lived in the area. As soon as the announcement spread, it seemed like a long-desired burst of energy swept through the community. She overheard neighbors at the grocery store chattering about secret family recipes and rumors of a reporter from a nearby city who might cover the event. Some folks pinned their hopes on drawing tourists back to the town. Others, who had once left, wrote on community forums that they planned to return just to see the new bake-off. The spark of possibility was in the air, intangible but real. On a crisp morning, a few days before the event sign-up closed, Esther carefully unfolded one of her grandmother's old notebooks. Pages were stained with splotches of batter, chocolate, and flour, each marking a memory. Esther let her eyes roam until she found a recipe she remembered vividly: honey and lavender loaf. Once she had tasted a slice of that loaf straight out of the oven, the steam rising in gentle curls. The flavor had been warm and delicate, like a summer breeze through the lavender bushes outside her grandmother's garden. This has to be it, she murmured. Still, she felt an urge to experiment, to blend the old with the new. After taking a deep breath, she added her own flair to the recipe. A swirl of zesty lemon curd layered beneath a distinctly sweet cream, reminiscent of the lemon trees her grandmother used to keep in the backyard. It was a risk, but something in her bones said the combination could be magical. In the week leading up to the contest, Esther worked fervently. She saved every spare coin to purchase the freshest lavender she could afford from the local farmer, Michael, whose greenhouse had survived the economic downturn, largely because he refused to abandon the soil that had fed his family for generations. Michael, noticing the look in Esther's eyes, equal parts determination and desperation, threw in extra sprigs of lavender for free. "If you can bring new life to the town with your baking, it's the least I can do," he told her. The gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes. She went to another local supplier to get quality honey, and the woman behind the counter shared that her daughter, who had moved away, was coming home just to see the bake-off. Everywhere Esther turned, it seemed, people were longing for a reason to believe in Marigold again. When the day of the contest arrived, the town Central Park buzzed with more activity than it had seen in years. Streamers made of bright orange and yellow ribbons fluttered around the perimeter. Children scampered between booths where local artisans sold handmade crafts. The air smelled of yeast, sugar, cinnamon, and the sweet tang of early autumn leaves. Esther's heart fluttered as she approached the tent designated for the bakers. There were about a dozen others, each setting up stations for cookies, pies, artisanal breads, or confections of all sorts. Some were seasoned participants who had competed before, a few were novices, but they all seemed to share the same determined spark. Esther gingerly placed her utensils, a wooden spoon passed down from her grandmother, and her well-worn mixing bowl on the table. Nearby, an older gentleman with a puffy mustache set up a stand displaying large bowls of sourdough, their crusts crackling with seeds and grains. A younger woman whisked a cream mixture, occasionally glancing at a phone for the recipe's measurements. Nervous energy crackled between them all. A moment later, one of the organizers rang a bell to mark the start of the competition. Bakers had 3 hours to craft their entries from scratch. After that, they'd face the judges. While others worked with a flurry of fancy tools, Esther relied on her sense of touch, smell, and instinct. She measured the flour precisely, but allowed her grandmother's intuition to guide the ratio of lavender to honey. Gently, she warmed the milk and let the yeast awaken. As she stirred the batter, she recalled how her grandmother used to say that each swirl was like a prayer for the people who would share in the bread. As the lavender's floral fragrance mingled with the golden sweetness of the honey, Esther felt herself slip into a memory of standing by a window, watching her grandmother knead dough with hands that never seemed to tire. Tears pricked her eyes for a moment, but she blinked them away. She had work to do. The swirl of lemon curd required careful timing. Too soon, and it would sink to the bottom. Too late, and it might not fully incorporate. Esther gently folded the bright yellow curd into the batter, then carefully poured it all into the pan. She topped it with a thin drizzle of sweet cream, then slid it into the old contest oven provided by the organizers. The temperature gauge wasn't as precise as she would have liked, so she had to watch closely. All around her, bakers were testing textures, adjusting oven racks, or checking the crispness of cookies. Periodically, judges strolled through the aisles, scribbling notes. Spectators hovered at the workshop's edges, curious, excited, and hungry for the moment they could finally taste the results. When the fragrant loaf emerged from the oven, its crust was golden brown, and the swirl of lemony cream across the top had caramelized in spots, forming a delicate pattern. Esther felt her heart leap in relief and pride. She let it cool just enough to slice it, all the while inhaling the aroma that was both fresh and nostalgic. The honey, lavender, and lemon melded in a way that somehow encapsulated both her grandmother's memory and her own leap of creativity. This was her story in edible form, and she hoped the judges would feel every bit of love she had poured into it. After time was called, the bakers presented their creations on a long table at the front of the tent. The judges, two retired pastry chefs, the town's mayor, and a well known food enthusiast from a neighboring city, carefully tasted each entry. Esther stood off to the side, her stomach tied in knots. She wondered if she should have gone with something more classic. Perhaps her grandmother's old recipe needed no twists. Yet, the moment for second guessing was gone. She watched as the first judge sliced into her loaf, the blade revealing a subtle swirl of lemon curd. The second judge took a bite, closing her eyes for a moment as if absorbing the flavor. The third judge, wiping honey from his mustache, nodded appreciatively. The food writer from the neighboring city scribbled notes, an intent expression on her face. Esther tried to read their reactions, but it was impossible to tell from a distance. Her heart pounded. The judges retreated to a small table to deliberate. A hush fell over the crowd of spectators, families fidgeting with excitement, and fellow bakers exchanging nervous smiles. The quiet was broken only by the occasional shriek of a toddler or the rustle of the ribbons in the breeze. Finally, the mayor stepped forward. In her hand, she held a bundle of ribbons in different colors, blue, red, and yellow, along with a special rosette they'd created for an honorable mention category. One by one, the judge announced the winners for different categories. Best pie went to a middle-aged mother who had made apple caramel pie with a cinnamon crumble. A high school student took best cookies with her, chocolate peppermint sandwich cookies that sparkled with sugar dust. Then came the best bread category, and Esther held her breath as the judge paused dramatically. The older gentleman with the sourdough was awarded a respectable third place. Another local baker received second for a savory herb loaf that smelled divine. Esther felt her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear the speaker. Then the mayor's lips curved into a wide smile as she announced first place, Esther Graves, for her honey, lavender, and lemon swirl. Applause erupted. Esther's cheeks flushed and her hand drifted to her mouth in shock. Several neighbors cheered her name. She wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. The mayor beckoned her forward to receive her ribbon and a small cash prize. As she approached, her hands trembling, she could barely believe she stood where her grandmother once had, triumphant yet humble. The judges praised Esther for the complexity of flavors and the story she told through her creation. People might forget a face, they said, but seldom did they forget a taste that awakened both the palate and the heart. After the awards were distributed, spectators and participants were invited to take samples. Before Esther could even blink, her loaf had been sliced in two and eagerly devoured by townspeople who praised its taste. Many closed their eyes, reminiscing about childhood memories of simpler times, a grandmother's kitchen, a family holiday, a sunny morning with fresh-baked bread and jam. Some of them came up to Esther with tears in their eyes, thanking her for reminding them that Marigold Town once had and could still have a warm sense of community. Word spread quickly. The local newspaper wrote an article featuring Esther's loaf and quoted a few judges who called it a taste of hope. The story was picked up by a small regional news outlet, so over the next few days, strangers even from neighboring towns began to trickle into the bakery, curious about this unique bread. Esther soon found herself working longer hours, her once quiet bakery now a lively space filled with chatter and laughter. She saw parents buying treats for their children, couples holding hands over shared pastries, and even traveling foodies coming in to taste the bread that so many had praised. The success reinvigorated the bakery in more ways than one. With the modest prize money and the influx of new customers, she was able to fix the wobbly display case, repaint the storefront, and invest in better equipment. She also placed framed photographs of her grandmother on one wall, beside clippings of the article about her victory. We want to show everyone where this started, she said, gently touching the frame. Customers who noticed the pictures often asked about the story behind them, giving her a chance to talk about her grandmother's passion for bringing people together through baking. In an era where many felt estranged and uncertain, it was a potent reminder of the resilience that people could find in shared traditions and creativity. Encouraged by Esther's success, other local businesses started to see possibilities. The hardware store, which had been on the brink of closure, collaborated with a local carpenter to design new shelves and countertops so that new entrepreneurs might consider opening shops. A vacant building next to the bakery was rented out by a young couple who decided to open a small coffee house. Local artists began displaying paintings in that coffee house, and soon a modest but lively art market took shape on Saturday mornings. Little by little, the neighborhood that once felt desolate started to pulse with a renewed sense of promise. Of course, the recovery wasn't instantaneous or free of hardships. Some days, customers were still sparse, and the economy scars could not vanish overnight. But the bake-off and Esther's bread had struck a chord. Even outside, visitors noticed that something had shifted in Marigold Town, like the first sprouts of green after a harsh winter. Hope had found its way into the battered soul of the community. And it wasn't just about a single recipe. It was the act of one person channeling history, heart, and a little risk into a creation that could encourage everyone else to dream again. Esther realized that while winning the competition had been a sweet moment, the best reward was seeing people reunited around simple things: the aroma of freshly baked bread, the delight of children biting into warm pastries, and the lingering sense of optimism in the air. She wrote new recipes, experimenting with different herbs and spices, sometimes soliciting feedback from customers, other times from new friends she met through the growing local network. She revived her grandmother's old tradition of hosting free baking lessons in the bakery for anyone who wanted to learn, young or old, skilled or novice. The sessions filled with laughter and the satisfying sound of dough being kneaded. Every now and then, someone would mention how they once believed in Marigold Town, but had lost faith until that day they tasted Esther's bread. Time and again, she was reminded of the power a single act could have. Soon enough, local organizations approached Esther about helping to plan next year's bake-off. She accepted eagerly, wanting to ensure that this spark wouldn't vanish after the excitement wore off. She joined committees to brainstorm ways to highlight other community members' talents. One idea was a Taste of Marigold festival, where bakers, farmers, crafters, and musicians would come together to celebrate the town's heritage. This place used to be about family, about people caring for one another, said one of the council members in a planning meeting. With your help, maybe we can make it even more than it once was. Over the following weeks, a warm camaraderie began to envelop Marigold. The post office started displaying locally made greeting cards. A struggling bookstore partnered with a local poet to host poetry readings on weekends. Whenever Esther was out marketing or running errands, she met neighbors sharing stories of why they had chosen to stay or how they had returned. Business signs, once chipped and faded, started looking freshly painted. The roads were still rough and job opportunities were still a challenge, but at least the invisible gloom that had weighed on the town seemed to fade a bit each day. One evening, well after the bakery had closed, Esther sat alone by the window. The moonlight highlighted the gentle lines embedded in the old wooden spoon that had once belonged to her grandmother. She ran her thumb across those lines, thinking about how many loaves that spoon had stirred into existence, how many moments of comfort it had helped birth. She remembered the time her grandmother let her taste batter from that very spoon for the first time, telling her with a wide grin, "Love is an ingredient no one can see, but everyone can taste." At the time, Esther was too young to grasp the significance of those words, but now their meaning settled around her like a warm blanket. She closed her eyes, recalling the hush that fell over her when she heard her name called as the winner of the bake-off. More vividly, she remembered the wave of relief and gratitude as the townspeople crowded her booth, not just to celebrate her success, but to share in a moment that felt deeply significant for them all. She felt tears threaten to fall again, but they were happy tears. This was bigger than a ribbon or a prize. It was the realization that communal resilience could be kindled by one person's steadfast faith in what they loved doing. The next morning, Esther woke up before dawn, as always, to prepare fresh dough. It was still dark, but a gentle pink on the horizon hinted at the coming sunrise. The birds were just beginning their early morning chorus. She swept the bakery floor, wiped down the counters, and carefully arranged her ingredients. With a patient and deliberate hand, she began mixing flour, water, yeast, and salt. She sprinkled in a dash of lavender, a swirl of honey, and the zest of a plump lemon. The aroma enveloped her, reminding her that each new day brought with it the chance to feed someone's soul, to spark a little more brightness in her small corner of the world. Soon, light filled the windows, and the door's bell jingled with the arrival of her first customer. Familiar faces followed, neighbors who would greet her warmly, travelers who had read about her bread, and curious newcomers lured by the scent. Some would sit at a tiny table near the window to savor a slice of her loaf with coffee, while others took pastries to go. Either way, they left with more in their hearts than they'd come in with. If that wasn't magic, Esther didn't know what was. In the end, people would surely forget who had won which bake-off or recall only a hazy memory of the day's speeches and ribbons. But they would remember the fragrance of lavender twined with citrus and the soft warmth of bread that glowed like a hidden sunrise inside each slice. That they would remember how, in a time when it felt like hope was slipping through their fingers, one aspiring baker with a weathered recipe notebook recreated a taste that pulled them closer together. And in that closeness, under small tables, under bright ribbons, or along streets revitalized by fresh beginnings, Marigold Town discovered that the sweetest ingredient of all was the renewed sense of belief in each other and in what tomorrow might hold.